Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today to do my monthly wrap-up for the month of February. All the books that I read and was working on in the month of February. There were no DNFs. I will tell you that right now. But there are some books that I was reading that I did not finish, which will be carrying over into March. We'll be going through all of that, all of the lovely things to wrap up the month of February so we can move on with March. So, in the month of February, I finished 4 books, and I have 3 books that are still in progress. That means I have finished 8 books so far in 2021. The only reason I bring that up is because I mentioned in my last Friday Reads video that I'm trying not to think so much about the total number of books that I read in a year, and I am sort of in transition and figuring out like a page goal and different ways of thinking about reading. But because I'm still in that like transition period, I am still interested in that. And I actually recently changed my goal on Goodreads. It had been 60, but I changed it to 50 because as I changed my reading priorities for the year of 2021, basically I've kind of embraced slower reading, and I'm trying to read one book at a time, one audiobook and one physical book. And that means I'm probably not going to be getting through things as quickly as I was last year. So I was perpetually like 1 or 2 books behind on Goodreads, and just seeing that kind of stresses me out, even when I'm not trying to think about how many books I'm reading. So that's gone now that I've lowered it to 50. I am working on a pages goal, but I have just kind of like a set thing because people pointed out after my last Friday Reads video, Goodreads does have a way of seeing the page count. They didn't advertise that page to me at the end of 2020. I don't know why, but whatever. So I can't see how many pages I read, but it's still not accurate because I like to include books that I DNF as something I read, even if I don't rate them. So basically I have a threshold. If I get about a quarter of the way into the book, I count it as something that I read for the year. I might not rate it or anything like that, but so it's not an accurate page count and I can't really use it anyway. So I just kind of arbitrarily made a number based on the fact that I want to read 50 books, assuming that each book might have basically around 300 pages. So that came out to 15,000 pages for the year. I'm at 16% of that, and I'm also at 16% of my number goal, which I don't really care about, but just, since we're talking about it, there it is. That's how far I've gotten on that so far. Once I have a bit of a track record with a page goal and I see more of an accurate number, I'm trying to figure out a way of continuing to count DNFs, but maybe get a more accurate page number. I may have to create something myself. I'm using the story graph for the page goal, but I may have to just create something myself to keep track of something accurate for how many pages I read in a year. Because, like I said, if I get about a quarter of the way through, I count it as something I read because I spent time on it. But it's complicated, basically, and I don't want to just allow a system to count the full page total of a book just because I marked it as read. I'll figure it out. That's in process. So the 4 books that I read, which we're about to get into, are The Prettiest Star by Carter Sickels, The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr., Let Me Tell You What I Mean by Joan Didion, and Real Life by Brandon Taylor. So we're going to start with The Prettiest Star by Carter Sickels. I've been watching that new TV series, It's a Sin, and it's actually a good companion piece to The Prettiest Star, which is a debut novel about a guy named Brian who left home at the age of 18 to move to New York City and come out of the closet. Now, in 1986, that is the time in which the book is set, Brian has just lost his partner to AIDS and will soon be dead of the same disease. He doesn't have anywhere to go. He doesn't want to be a burden to anybody, so he returns home to Ohio. Not only does he have to face the discrimination of his family and his hometown because he is gay, he has to face the stigma of having AIDS in a time when it was deeply feared, little understood, and intentionally ignored by people in power, which allowed it to fall prey to a lot of misinformation. And his family also has to suffer that same discrimination. Again, not just because they have someone gay in their family, but because there's somebody living in their house who everyone is afraid of because of this condition that he has. The perspective shifts between Brian, his mother, and his sister. I thought it was a little curious that Brian's point of view is largely missing from the first half of the book. It's sort of, he takes a lot more of the narrative in the back half of the book. The first half spends a lot more time with his mother and sister, but in the end, I think this was actually a really smart approach by Carter Sickels because it allows him to avoid pitfalls that may have otherwise made the book feel emotionally manipulative. If you spend too much time with Brian before you get to know him, you have to talk about living and dying and the death of all of his friends, and it's like a minefield of emotional material. And this also allows us to get to know the family, and it allows us time to get to know Brian a little bit better before we get into the really heavy stuff in the book. Now, I will say it is a flawed book, but it's a really wonderful story. It's also important because, in a way, and this is where it's very similar to It's a Sin, the TV show, this book shows how AIDS could be used as a method of erasure. If a family doesn't like their son's gay lifestyle or the method of his untimely death, they can pretend like it never happened. And that's something that kind of comes up a lot as he comes home and he's sick. They want to tell people that he has cancer, and he kind of struggles with that because he doesn't want to lie to people. He doesn't want to erase his identity. And it very much deals with that and that process. The other good thing about this book is that it really allows Brian and his family to be complex characters who don't always react to things in the best way, and it doesn't force modern understandings on them. Because we now have a very different perspective on AIDS and HIV. Obviously, it is a very different condition than it was back then. But it doesn't force them all to just kind of accept things. And even when people do accept things, Carter Sickels really grapples with the way in which they might have blind spots where they're not quite aware of all of the complicating factors. For instance, Brian has a friend who comes to visit and is kind of radically accepting of a lot of things, and she challenges the family's perspective on a lot of things, but it's like too much. She pushes beyond the threshold of what even the mother, who's probably the most accepting person in the family, it pushes beyond the boundary of even what the mother is capable of at that moment in that time. And the grandmother is sort of blindly accepting of this is fine, everything's fine. But she also has this kind of perspective where she isn't really ready to accept that he's going to die. She's really holding on to hope that he will live and that everything will be fine. And everything is not going to be fine. So Carter Sickels allows these people to have all of these complicated reactions wherever they fall on the spectrum. And the other thing that I really like about it is that frequently when we're in times of stress or when we have emotional things going on with family, we don't always respond in rational ways. And that really comes out in this book. For instance, so much of this book would be solved if the family would just sit down and talk to each other, and they don't really do that. And it would be easy to get frustrated by that, but it feels very genuine and it feels very real, because sometimes when you are really stressed, you isolate yourself from people, even people who could help you or care about you. And that is something that happens to a lot of the members of this family. They silo themselves off from the things that could help them. And that's one of the things that Carter Sickels is kind of grappling with, because especially in Brian's perspective, and I don't want to get into spoilers, but he does meet another gay man in Ohio, and they form a friendship. And it's because he feels so unable to relate to his family that he can't communicate who he is adequately, and the circumstances of his life and his sickness and how he feels. So having someone who does kind of understand makes him reach out to that person rather than relate to his family. And I just think that's really genuine and very beautiful. And I love the way it's handled. So I would definitely recommend this book. Like I said, it does have flaws. It's a debut novel after all, but it makes me very curious to see what Carter Sickels will do next. I enjoyed it a great deal. I had ugly cries at least 2 or 3 times. It's a very emotional book. And like I said, I think it's important to engage with stories like this. Jen the librarian had a conversation about It's a Sin on her channel and about AIDS and everything. And, I'm kind of in a place where I think about how I learned about AIDS and things like that. And I don't want to get into the whole thing, but, it is something that we still live with today and something we still don't have a cure for today. And the ways in which people reacted to it back then still matter now. And the way in which people reacted back then and the way in which we react to it now, it still defines so much about gay life, because it was seen as a gay disease, even though it affects everyone. And I don't know, I just find that really fascinating. And I don't want to go into a whole lot about it right here where we're doing a wrap-up of other things, but I think it's a very worthwhile book that I hope a lot more people will discover. The next book was The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. This was another really emotionally devastating book, I kind of had to take a bit of a step back after finishing both The Prettiest Star and The Prophets because, oh boy, it was a lot. Reading a book about someone dying of AIDS and then going to this book, which is very much about slavery, it's a lot. It's a very heavy mental spot. So I'm still kind of emotionally recovering from both of those. Anyway, I loved this book. It had a rather rapturous response when it was first published in January, and in my own limited way, I probably contributed to that. I mean, I don't know how many people follow my channel and were inspired to read it. I know a lot of people said that they were, but they also mentioned Simon. So I don't pretend to be like an influencer or anything like that, but I probably did contribute to a lot of really rapturous discourse about this book. I've started seeing some backlash, or maybe backlash isn't quite the right word for it. It's probably more like opposing viewpoints, people who have a very different experience of this book. That sounds more fair. So if you do pick this up, I hope you love it as much as I did. This is ostensibly the story of Samuel and Isaiah, who are two enslaved men in the pre-Civil War era who are in love with each other. But it's actually a lot more expansive than that. The love story is the center that everything sort of orbits around. It's actually the story of the entire plantation and also of the ancestors of the people who have been placed on the plantation. The chapters weave between a very large cast of characters, but the story of Samuel and Isaiah is always pushed forward somehow through the other person's point of view. It gives you a very rich sense of the breadth of experience and the really different perspectives or reactions to circumstance that everyone has in this plantation, which is known as Empty. That's not the actual name of the plantation, but they call it Empty. The ways some people reject the notion of slavery outright, the ways in which some people try to game the system in their advantage or in their favor, even if that means putting some of the other people on the plantation down. And you even get a bit of a sense of the hierarchy of the white people, because even among the people who oversee the enslaved people, there is a defined hierarchy. And even though one of the overseers is a family of the people who own the plantation, he is treated very differently within society and within the family. And that is kind of interesting as well. It definitely requires active participation on the part of the reader, and it's not always easy to follow, which seems to be the part that has kind of turned some people off the most. To me, it's every bit as sumptuous as reading a Toni Morrison book, and it requires you to engage with it, but the rewards of putting in that effort are plentiful. If you don't like Toni Morrison, this might not be the book for you. I happened to just absolutely love it. So far, it is my favorite read of the year. It could very well still be my favorite read of the year when we get to December. We'll have to wait and see. If you follow along, you know that last year I read Song of Solomon in January, maybe early February, and it was my favorite read of the year all the way through 2020. Will it happen again? I don't know. There's room for something to come out in the top, but we'll see how that develops. I just really enjoyed this book so much. As difficult as it was, as upsetting as it frequently was, I really enjoyed it. And like I said, I kind of hinted at the stories of like the white people who live in the house. It does a great job of showing ways in which everyone has created traps or is stuck in a trap that was not necessarily of their own making within society, and how there might be a white person who is gay and therefore kind of ostracized from the group. You have the wife who has no agency over anything around her and tries to find her own ways of grasping onto the world. It's all fascinating, and I think it also really deals with the idea of the sort of white colonial influence and the influence of religion, these kind of sort of constructs that we have created that and are supposed to be tools of love and acceptance and can be tools of division and discrimination instead. You can see that playing out in the story of the ancestors, but you can also see that playing out right on the plantation with Samuel and Isaiah, because by and large, people didn't mind that they lived together and were clearly in a romantic relationship until one of the other enslaved men on the plantation is taught by the plantation owner to be a sort of like a reverend to the other black people on the plantation. And he uses the Bible to single out Samuel and Isaiah, and people start to avoid them and discriminate against them and not accept them as much as they did in the past. And it's really interesting to see that play out, how people change their dynamic and how they think about things because of new definitions about what is seen as acceptable, and how they become so real that you can't escape them. I just thought this was a really fascinating book, and like I said, if you read this, I hope you loved it every bit as much as I did, because I absolutely loved it. The next book I read in February was Let Me Tell You What I Mean by Joan Didion, a collection of previously unpublished essays that, to me, show why she is one of the best nonfiction writing talents out there. I have never read her fiction, but her musings on writing and creating a fictional universe have me so curious that I may seek some of her fiction writing out. That's how good I thought this was. This collection also prompts some really great thinking about how everything is viewed from the lens of the creator, be it writing or television or photography, and like any form of art. Even, this channel, for example, everything that you see on it comes from my point of view, and I can try to be as open and honest as I can, but it's still always going to be from my point of view. And the things I talk about a specific book are my interpretations about it. So I may leave out something that could be important, or things like that. It's a fascinating way of thinking. And some of the best pieces explore the line between perception of reality and how impossible it is to capture anything real. The best example of this I can think of is an essay about Nancy Reagan. In the 1960s, when Nancy Reagan was just the First Lady of California, long before she became the First Lady of the United States, Joan Didion was assigned to spend a day with her and write an article about a day in the life of Nancy Reagan. And Joan Didion writes about this as sort of a farce, because the very notion that she could ever get an actual understanding of what a day in the life of Nancy Reagan is kind of ludicrous. And having her follow Nancy Reagan along, in and of itself, creates an unreal environment. So you'll never really get a sense of what the day is like. And it just so happens that the same day a television crew is with Nancy Reagan, and they are supposed to be doing the same thing, get some footage of an actual day in the life of Nancy Reagan. However, they are sort of prompting her toward things like, so, would you garden in a typical day? And Nancy Reagan's like, sure, I would garden. So they talk about what kind of flowers she might be able to pick, and there's like a negotiation of what reality they should present. And she ultimately, even knowing the importance of appearances, grabs clippers and gloves and a basket that is too small to carry the flowers that she is about to cut. But it's all about the appearance of her doing something that could be typical of an actual day, but it's not an actual day. And to me, that's just really fascinating. And this is something that comes up again and again and again throughout the collection. And then the final one is about Martha Stewart, and that is the one most people talk about. And it's really interesting because in part she talks about the legacy and the creation of this Martha Stewart, and how the appearance and the image that is being crafted is the most important thing of all, and how all of it hangs on Martha Stewart's image, which is of course interesting because we all know that later on Martha Stewart was found guilty of insider trading and spent a year in jail. To me, it is just a fascinating collection. Some of the works are really small and slight. They get longer as it goes along. It starts in 1967, and I believe the year 2000 is when the Martha Stewart piece was published. So it kind of spans a really broad range of experience. And Joan Didion herself, she's such a big part of the collection and the writing, and I really enjoyed it a lot. The final book that I finished in the month of February was Real Life by Brandon Taylor. And I can't tell you anything about it because it's for the BookTube Prize. So stay tuned for thoughts on this, but it is something I finished. I actually listened to it on audio, even though I have this physical copy. And so stay tuned for thoughts about this. I will be able to talk about it once this round of the BookTube Prize is over. In things that I am currently reading, I'm listening to an audiobook, Just As I Am by Cicely Tyson, that is carrying over into the month of March. I am reading this book, which I'm not going to pronounce the name of, but which you can see right here. It's a collection of cartoons by Alison Bechdel, who is most famous for having written Fun Home, a memoir. And Just As I Am is a memoir about Cicely Tyson's life and career and navigating Hollywood as a Black actress and all of that. It's fascinating. I love it. I recommend it. This I don't quite recommend yet. It's a nice little diversion, which is exactly what I needed after finishing 2 really heavy books in a row. But I can only really do it in small bursts. So even though I had pledged to myself I'm only going to read one physical book and one physical book and one audiobook at a time, I picked up a third book, which is the final revival of Opal and Nev by Dawnie Walton. I am reading this from NetGalley, and I am really enjoying it so far. It is the story of Opal and Nev, obviously, but it takes the form of an oral history where they're looking back at the creation of their duo and what drove them apart and what caused their controversial career. There are allegations that I will be getting to. And it's largely about how Opal is a black woman trying to make it in the music industry and how she was criticized and held account for speaking her mind in ways that other people might not have. And I think I'm really enjoying it so far. So I will be finishing that. Also coming up in March, I have to finish the BookTube prize round, which is really starting to stress me out because The Mirror and the Light is on the horizon. I don't have the book, but I do have the jacket. And it's a chunky book. I'm going to be doing this for March of the Mammoths, and hopefully I will be able to get through it. I also have to do Luster by Raven Leilani, American Dirt by Janine Cummins, and in addition to that, I have to do Utopia Avenue by David Mitchell, Death in Her Hands by Otessa Moshfegh, and then I will be done. But that's really going to define my March reading, and I really kind of need to get started on that. So I would love to hear what you've been up to in the month of February, what you've read, what you've loved, disliked, DNF'd, what have you. Tell me what you've been up to. Put it in the comment section down below. I would really appreciate your thoughts about any of these things I've talked about. If you have recommendations based on any of this as well, please let me know. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.